Hi, so welcome to another Facebook Live about the inner critic. So this is part of a series of lives which is all about the critic, building awareness of it, and some really useful tools to be able to gain freedom from it so that you can be more yourself and more confident. So if you're enjoying these lives, please remember to click the button and to join my page. So today we're going to be looking at shadow and the critic. So even the word shadow, it has quite a kind of dark or sinister sort of connotation. So, but what I mean by when I use the word shadow is anything within our unconscious that we hide, repress, or deny. So the reason why it's interesting to work with shadow is often there's things within ourselves that have been repressed that are actually really useful. So by working with shadow, it's actually an opportunity to get in touch with qualities that we don't have, like self-confidence, or sensitivity, or whatever it is for you. So let's go back to the start, and we touched on this in the last live. We were talking about being a child and how it is for a child in the world. So when we come into the world, when we're born as babies, we have all of the facets of human expression. And you see this, if you're around a small child, you see 1 minute they're really happy, there's loads of joy and excitement. Next minute they're a little bit scared. And then they might burst into tears and get really sad. Or they might get really angry and express their anger. So all of these different emotions are kind of coming through in a child, being expressed. But as a child begins to grow, they pick up on their environment and they learn what kinds of behaviours get them love and what kinds of behaviours get them told off. So they kind of learn what's okay. And of course, every set of parents, even if parents have done a lot of work on themselves, they're still going to carry things that they don't allow within themselves. And the children pick up on this. So if they learn, if when I'm young I learn that anger actually isn't okay, I learn to hold that back within myself. So it's like I take my anger and I push it into shadow. I hide it away. I don't allow it. And I quite like this analogy that Robert Bly makes of having a shadow bag. It's like a bag that we carry around on our backs, and we've all got one, we've all got a shadow, and anything that isn't okay gets kind of like pushed into shadow. So if I put my anger into shadow, then I grow up as a child learning not to be angry. I kind of keep my anger away. And that might be very well. I might grow up as a young adult who's kind of more into sort of new age things, and I don't engage with anything that's angry. But then I find that when I'm an adult, I'm in a little discussion with my partner, and then all of a sudden my anger kind of comes out and I stamp my foot and I'm back to kind of the fury of a 2-year-old. So the anger that I pushed back, that I tried to hold away in shadow, has kind of forced its way out. And because it's been within that bag, it kind of hasn't matured and it's very young, and I find myself behaving in a way that isn't actually who I am. So this is what shadow is about. So why would I want to take the anger out the shadow bag? I mean, anger isn't a very popular thing. Whatever we put in the bag, whatever it is, whatever gets pushed in, even if it seems like something that's really unhealthy, it has a golden quality within it. So anger, which is one that I'm really familiar with, by the way, because I did put my anger into shadow a fair bit. What gets pushed away when you push away your anger is a natural sense of power and confidence. So it's kind of like the baby gets thrown out with the bathwater. When we learn to mold ourselves into being a particular way. And of course, the other thing is that if the energies are in shadow, they kind of burst out in ways that aren't very helpful in our lives and in our relationships. So taking these energies out of shadow actually gives us more energy to be who we are. And the critic is a really important part of this. So you might have already picked up in kind of what I've been saying, how the critic comes into play in it. So critic is part of the process within us that helps us to put things into shadow. Critic develops young to help us with that process. And there are other parts involved. So there's a lot more to this. There's a lot more to this kind of mechanism that we use to repress. And it's a big part of the work that I do, which there isn't time to go into all the detail in this live. But the important thing is the critic, which is what we're focusing on, is very involved in this process. So we heard in the last live how the critic judges what isn't allowed, what doesn't get us love. So the critic judges us for behaving in these ways that we're trying to push into shadow. And this is really useful, because by definition we're unconscious of our shadow. It's like we don't actually know what's there. So how do we get to see it? Well, if we can build an awareness of our critic, we not only get to disengage from our critic, which is really, really useful, but by listening to what judgments we make, we also learn about what has been shoved into shadow. So by bringing awareness of what we judge, both within ourselves and in the world actually, we can actually have a little window into what is it that's being repressed within myself. So really useful key to gain access. And if we disown the critic, so if we don't have that awareness, if the critic is operating in shadow, so we don't have an awareness of the critic, which is actually the case for most people, then we lose the ability to kind of see what's being judged, to actually know a little bit about our own shadow. So in a way, the critic is like a real key. It's like a window into seeing what is going on within us on an unconscious level. And I'll give some common examples of the kind of thing that gets pushed into shadow, actually the kind of things that in our society are in shadow. So one of them is anger, which I already mentioned. So it's very common for people to find that they've got anger in their shadow. And if that's in shadow, it's the power and confidence that kind of gets thrown out, the baby with the bathwater. The other thing that is, for most people, in shadow to some extent, is sexual energy. So the critic can be very critical of anything sexual that might not fit in. From the child's perspective, there's a big risk in being sexual in the wrong way. So the critic learns to push that back. And what gets thrown out then isn't just our ability to be free in our sexuality. Actually, it's the connection with all of those lower centers. It's our natural life force. It's our kind of creativity and expression that gets lost. It may be that we weren't allowed to be needy when we were young. So our neediness, the needs of the child, get pushed into shadow. So I appear like someone who doesn't need anything. But then because the inner child is kind of in shadow, it means that I lose my sensitivity and my ability to connect and build close relationships with people. It might be that my selfishness is in shadow. This is common as well, because in society in general it's seen as good to be generous. And if my selfishness isn't allowed, it'll still continue in shadow. And what's lost then is actually the ability to look after oneself and kind of separate. And then there's the critic itself. So if the critic is pushed into shadow, not only does that mean it's more difficult to see what's in our shadow bag, it also means that we lose touch with qualities like authority, like the intelligence and focus that the critic actually has. So by taking our critic out of shadow and getting to know it, we can actually bring on board those energies for ourselves. And if our critic remains in shadow, it can use all of the energies that aren't allowed within us. So if anger is within our shadow, our critic can use that, which is why often people who aren't very angry or in touch with their power find that they have a very angry inner critic. And there's a way in which we can work to take back the energy. So as we start to engage with the energies that have been in shadow, with anger, with sexuality, as we start to own them and express them in a clean way, which is resonant with how we want to be in the world, that actually takes power out of the critic. It's like they've got less to use within their unconscious arsenal. So there's a lot more to say about this process of taking energies back for ourselves from the critic. But one thing that's useful, one thing that's kind of simple and can be applied, is the other way to work with the critic, as well as becoming aware of it, disengaging with it, as well as building up that other positive voice, is to actually use some of these energies, some of our life force. So simple things like going out for a run, doing weights or aerobics or whatever it is that kind of brings you alive, doing things that you really love. So really following your heart and going out and doing stuff. Often you might notice that when you're doing things you really love, like the critic is less strong. So I'm going to go into more detail on that on the next live that I do. But this is a really neat way of pulling energy out of the shadow, out of the arsenal of the critic, and reclaiming it for ourselves. So I think that is all that I have to say for today's live. So it's kind of like there's a bit more to this, and I'm going to cover it in the next one. But the key points here are that we all have a shadow, or at least I've never met anybody who doesn't. And our critic, by building awareness of our critic, we can actually learn a bit more about what's in our shadow. So I hope that's been useful for you. Please share this if it has been, and I look forward to the